Stefan. Okay, Malte, Stefan, and Per wrote me that he will join us a bit later because he's involved in another conference and is presenting somewhere else. Yeah, I think we can wait a couple more minutes and then we can start. Malte, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Nijmegen in the Netherlands.
Okay.
I was here at the workshop and yeah.
Yes.
So I guess you're the closest to Utrecht now.
That's true. I traveled through Utrecht yesterday and I shed a tear. I collected a tear.
How is it that you're able to have your conference and we couldn't have ours?
Well, it's a workshop with only 10 participants. So yeah, but it's still a little weird to be here without the HES happening. So
yeah,
we pay for being successful. And Stefan, where are you calling from?
Well, from Zwickau, and I hope the internet will be okay. So from home.
Okay.
I still have some in-person obligations, even though teaching is online. So you're in your office?
Me?
Nicola? Yeah.
No, I'm home. I'm in Florence.
Also, very nice place.
Yeah, thank you. Where are you calling from? And then we start.
Me?
Yeah, Theresa.
West of Germany, a little village close to Trier.
Okay, Trier. Oh,
I
nice.
think you might know Trier, Cologne.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
the birthplace of Karl Marx.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. Hi, Gianluca. Okay, so I guess we can start. And, yeah, because we have a very busy session with 4 presentations, and as I wrote you this afternoon, we'll try to stick to a 15 minutes presentation and then leave 7-8 minutes for question and answers. There are no discussions, so we can start. The session, of course, is about Vienna, and we can start with Malte, Dold, and Mario Rizzo. Did Carl Menger have a welfare economics? That's a very interesting question. So the floor is yours.
well, Mario is the better dressed person here, so he will speak and I will remain silent.
okay, but if I make mistakes, that's even more reason to remain silent. Okay, so this paper, which is in a draft right now, and anybody who wants it can just send me an email or Malte an email, was originally called Does Menger Have a Welfare Economics? But what we found out was that it was very, very difficult to answer that question without answering prior questions about the nature of exact laws. So we changed the title, and while at the very end we will answer the question, we have to go through some other material first. So as I've said before, here is the cultural context. At least part of it anyway, the Vienna School of Dancing, typical Viennese ball of the 19th century. Here is Menger at the heat of the Methodenstreit with his eyes in a very interesting pose, either the light of reason or simply anger. So we begin with what Mises called the notorious slip. Now, Mises was criticizing Menger's discussion of imaginary needs, imaginary goods, and non-economic prices. And for those who are not familiar, Menger distinguished imaginary needs, which are to be contrasted with real needs, that is, needs that are consistent in some objective sense with enhancing the individual's life and his or her well-being. Imaginary goods are those which objectively do not exist, lead to the satisfaction of true needs. Individuals are mistaken about the causal connection between the good and the end satisfaction. And non-economic prices, which kind of falls out of the first two, are the prices that result when people commit errors of one sort or another in evaluating market goods. Now, the reason that Mises considered this a slip and a notorious slip is because he viewed Menger's project as adding to or creating a subjectivist economics. And this was Menger's incomplete subjectivism. Mises wanted to completely subjectivize the concepts and laws of economics. In his mind, the laws of economics apply exactly with the appropriate adjustments, even when individual actors commit errors. If people believe that some desire is a need or simply wish to indulge or whim, or they believe that some good will satisfy a need or whim, then any price determined on the market is economic, according to Mises, or more precisely, that the distinction makes no sense. The laws are characterized for Mises in terms of what people think. So for Mises, no exception is possible. For Menger, inconsistency with full empirical reality was possible, but irrelevant. So what are the exact laws and how do they relate to full empirical reality? The purpose of Menger's exact laws is to understand error-prone full empirical reality. He consistently says that. Menger said that the real events are exemplifications or are covered by ideal typical characterizations or laws. But how is this possible? So to understand that, we have to understand what ideal types and exact laws are. Menger does not use the word ideal type. He uses the word real type. And Fritz Mach has a very interesting article on ideal types and real types, and claims, and I agree, that Menger did not use the word, but he had the concept. Ideal types are abstract agents who display in an exaggerated form the essential features of a real world actor, or consumer, or producer, or entrepreneur. These types, these ideal types of individuals, are connected to the exact laws. These laws are the modes of behavior of ideal typical agents. They are strictly determined when we are given the current state of things and the goals of the agents. So under specified conditions, the exact laws are strictly determined. Now, these exact laws are viewed by Menger as exhibiting the highest degree of perfection. Now, the question is, what does he mean by perfection? The exact laws portray the essence of actual economic events because they explain the cause of their current existence, as in statics, or their origin in ideal typical form, as in dynamics or evolutionary analysis. For Menger, the cause of an economic phenomenon is being used in a teleological sense, the reason for the thing's sustained existence. The origin refers to why the phenomenon type has come into existence when it didn't exist at a prior time, the cause of its coming into being. So the first is the cause of its sustained existence, its current being. The second is the cause of its coming into being. In each of these cases, the phenomenon is sustained or originates in the individual's expectation for the success of his action, not for its failure through one sort or another. So in a sense, then, the perfection or the perfect state is the reason why people want to bring the phenomenon into existence or why it is sustained. This leads us to what I'm calling the perfection maxim. In order to understand how things can go wrong, we must first understand how they can go right. The perfect sheds light on the imperfect. Now, this, what can be called, what Mises calls a foil analysis, was stressed by Hayek in his later business cycle analysis, but is not unique to Hayek. It was followed, for example, by Knight in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. In the first part, or the earlier part, he exhibits the perfectly competitive economy, but then only then does he go into the world of risk and uncertainty. And of course, it was followed by Wieser and von Böhm-Bawerk. Now, it's easy to understand the perfection maximum in a purely instrumental or convenient mental tool sense. But I think that for Menger, it's not simply a mental tool. It has a real or ontological basis in actual world phenomena themselves. This is where I think Menger gets confusing to the modern ear, and where he shows his Aristotelian colors, or as Mach says, his realist essentialism. So now maybe in some of your minds, this may be a deus ex machina, but we bring in J.S. Mill to the rescue. This is a Millian interpretation of Menger. There's no suggestion by us that Menger actually absorbed these ideas from Mill. However, it's perfectly possible. He did have copies of Mill's works. There is also no suggestion that Menger accepted Mill's basic philosophy of science. So Menger's exact laws are tendency laws. They describe what would happen in the absence of countervailing factors. For example, they tell us how prices would be determined if actors recognized their true needs, or only chose among true goods, or accurately knew their current situation, and were able to correctly order their needs and wants. So even countervailed causes are active. This is Mill's claim. The composition of causes is the idea that the effect of two or more causes acting together is the sum of the causes acting separately. For example, if a force acts upon an object pushing it toward the west and an equal force pushes it toward the east, it stays in its original position. However, both causes are active. Both have their full effect. Now, Mill says that the composition of causes doesn't apply everywhere, for example, not in chemistry. It clearly applies in mechanics, but what about social science? Mill says yes, implying that social science is best analyzed in a mechanical way, and Menger usually argues as if the answer is yes, although this is in tension with Menger's evolutionary ideas to a certain extent. So they're always active. The question now remains, these perfect laws or perfect ideal types, do they constitute a welfare standard? So now we finally get to the question. And here we found it useful to distinguish among three forms of welfare economics. One is, and this is due to Gull and Pessendorfer in an article called Welfare Without Happiness. Welfare one, this is well-being from the perspective of the actors themselves. For example, if actors believe that they committed errors or strive to correct them, or simply try to learn how to do better in the future, this is an example of a welfare standard which the actors themselves impose. And in this sense, Menger has a welfare standard. The idea of error simply explains the subsequent behavior of individuals. The attempt to attain perfection explains real-world behavior. Now, this is crucial. Menger believes that people will ultimately learn what is best, or at least better. So the standard that he sets up, the standard of perfection, is really an argument or an assertion that this is what people will tend toward. And when they make mistakes, still the law, the exact laws are still active in the sense that they continue to produce pressure or tendency toward the ultimate discovery of what is best, or at least better. These other notions that Gull and Pessendorfer mention, I think play no role. Welfare 2 is the concept of well-being actually held by policymakers. And I don't think we have policymakers really here. And welfare 3 is the concept of well-being that policy makers should have according to the moral philosophers or economists, plain moral philosopher. And I don't think we have that here either. So the upshot, and I think I'm going to end at this point, is the upshot is that Menger does not have a welfare economics in the sense that I think is primarily a policy relevant welfare economics, but he has one in terms of something which he believes will affect the actual behavior of individuals in their learning and ultimately recognizing what is best or at least better for them. So that's a long answer to our question about whether exact laws are normative. And I think I'm out of time.
No, actually, you have 2 more minutes. So if you wish to add
No,
something.
I'll stop here.
Okay.
I'll stop here.
Okay. Okay. So now it's time.
Let me
for,
take
yes.
Take this down here.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And we have I saw at least a couple of questions from the floors. You can raise your hand by clicking on the hand up option. I think Theresa wanted to make a question. No. Okay. I saw a couple.
There was applause for the presentation.
Oh, okay.
But I can nevertheless start with a question.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the interesting insights. And I appreciated the long road up to your answer, actually. And maybe you could elaborate a little more on this Aristotelian influence and the Uskalimeki point, because I found that really interesting. So how do you think this influence of Aristotelian philosophy on Menger played out in your particular question on exact laws?
Well, Menger does use the term essence quite frequently. And the problem with the word essence from a 21st century point of view, and even a 20th century point of view, is sometimes it just simply means something like the most important feature or something vague like that. And people don't understand what it means. And I think that the Aristotelian analysis that Mach presents of Menger is useful in understanding that. And so what Mach is trying to get at is that this is not just a notion of a instrumental convenience that you say that, well, the most important feature is this because it's convenient to analyze something in that way, but has to do with an assertion that these tendencies exist in some real way in the phenomena that is being described. So it's a question of ontological faithfulness, not a question of instrumental convenience. And I found that useful. I have to say that when I first came across Mach's work many, many years ago, I was very impatient with it, but I since learned to appreciate it.
Other questions? I have a question because if I may, because in passing you mentioned a possible inconsistency with this characterization of exact laws and the evolutionary framework of Mengerian analysis. So I was curious to know more about this.
Yeah, well, this is just something which I've thought about recently because we at NYU had a Menger conference recently, and it was mentioned that the evolutionary theories, have a biological analogy. It's not really a mechanical analogy. And Menger does seem sensitive to the biological aspects, at least in the second edition, especially when he's talking about true needs and the relation to biology and all of that. So, I'm beginning to think that perhaps a more careful analysis of Menger's evolutionary preliminary discussions of the origin of money, etc., might reveal something more than just a mechanical analogy, in which case then one has to see how this fits. So it's more right now at the stage of an intuition of mine rather than completely worked out.
Okay. Other questions, remarks? Malte, do you want to?
Well, maybe two things on both of the questions, which is interesting. I mean, this Aristotelian influence it also pops up in his discussion between true needs and imaginary needs, which is also interesting. Something that again is very weird from a modern economic point of view, right? Because whatever gets translated into a preference on the market should be, considered by the economists. But there is something interesting that goes back to this older Aristotelian tradition that connects, Menger to this discussion of needs, and something that is very, also biological. I mean, that you could say it's ontological slash metaphysical on the one hand, but there's also, especially in the second edition of his Magnus Opus, right, the Principles, Menger has this clear wish to ground economics in biology. Now, how you can trace that, and this is now, Nicola, your question, how you can bridge that with the more evolutionary account of money, for example, is interesting, and I think requires a more careful analysis that we don't provide in this paper. But also when he discusses money, Menger quotes Aristotle actually in a couple of footnotes. So it's interesting that I think Menger is definitely not going down the Misesian route in his understanding of evolutionary processes, but still has this urge to ground it in what Mach calls, I think, essential realism, which I think Mario and we both found fascinating, and we want to highlight because we think it's an underappreciated point actually in the Menger interpretation.
Thank you, Malte. Other remarks? No? Okay. Oh, yes, please.
Maybe
please.
Just one thing that we didn't now address in this version of our talk is that we actually think that Menger is surprisingly modern also when you look at recent developments in behavioral economics. Because behavioral economics, again, is obviously portrays itself as also grounding economic theory in psychological realism, right? And the interesting thing is that when you look at, for example, how behavioral economists model time preferences, they basically think like Menger. They have the standard neoclassical model of consistent time preferences as the rational standard, quote unquote, the right thing. But then you have countervailing forces that make the agent impulsive, and that's the so-called beta factor in behavioral models. And that's sort of the same thing. But the interesting thing is that the beta delta function, that's sort of the behavioral function that nowadays behavioral economists, or many behavioral economists, think that it describes intertemporal choice, is sort of that combined force of the neoclassical, right, right thing, quote unquote, right thing to do, and the countervailing force that at the same time is present. Now, whether they are ultimately thinking like an Aristotelian, that's, that can be doubted. But the interesting thing is there is something in the way Menger sets up the theory that is not just outdated, but it is actually popping up in the history of economic thought in the 20th and early 21st century.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, other questions, remarks?
Theresa, did you have another?
Do we have more time?
Yes, well, 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Well, this actually leads up to my presentation, because I wanted to ask, or maybe we can discuss that after my presentation, if Menger references Fechner, Gustav Theodor Fechner, because of course in the 19th century there lot more influences and discussions evolving around evolutionary biology, but also psychophysics, which is an evident influence in at least behavioral economics by Thaler. So I wondered if he is referencing Fechner in any case.
Not that I don't.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's now time to move on to Theresa Steffestun presentation, The Inner Constitution of Society. Friedrich Wieser in dialogue with Mach, Freud and Le Bon. So Theresa, the floor is yours. 15 minutes for
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. So now you should all see. So do you see the full screen of my presentation? Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present parts of my PhD research here, which is concerned with the concepts of psyche and power in the works of not only Friedrich Wieser, but also Friedrich Hayek, and their respective psychological and philosophical references. After carving out Wieser's particular approach to psyche and power in my first paper, the second one, which part of which I will present today, is concerned with the psychological scholarship these concepts, and particularly the concept of psyche is embedded in. So my interest here is twofold. First, better understand Wieser, of course, as a comparatively under-researched economist, and in particular his lesser studied works. And on the second hand, to better understand the time Wieser has worked in, fin de siècle Europe and Austria. And therefore I use Wieser kind of as a prism for his time uncovering interdisciplinary cross-fertilization and the transgression of ideas through economics, psychology, philosophy, and as we will see, also physiology. So as we don't have much time, I will start and get right in. One insight of my analysis of Wieser's work was that he pursues somehow a psychological turn, postulating that the inner constitution of society determines its outer constitution. So social theory and economics in particular should study the individual's inner constitution, the psyche of the individual in its specific configuration in order to understand society. And I found that Wieser can actually be regarded as one representative of a whole bunch of group belonging to liberal haute bourgeoisie in fin de siècle Austria that was concerned with what Karl Schorske, I don't know if you know him, he is an eminent scholar of that time, coined the Austrian problem of psyche and society. So what is this problem about? It's about integrating an increasingly fragmented and disintegrating post-revolutionary Austrian society. And by searching and redefining actually the two components of this relation, the individual and society, by looking into the psyche, by pursuing what Schorske calls a voyage intérieur, and by redefining the concept of man. And he follows this reshuffling of the self throughout a lot of fields. Wieser, of course, was not the only one tackling this problem. And Schorske discusses representatives from the field of architecture, arts, music, but also some of the men depicted here. Most prominently Sigmund Freud, who, of course, with his study of the unconscious, was very much concerned with redefining and exploring the inner self, the inner constitution of the individual. Also, Schorske counts Ernst Mach, who is a completely different field and sector to the circle of people concerned with this problem. And I would argue that Gustave Le Bon, who is of course not Austrian, but French, also as one who is concerned with this problem, which becomes most evident when you look at his publication, Psychology of the Masses in 1895. And of course, there are many, many more prominent scholars concerned with this problem. And why do I choose those three to accompany Wieser? First of all, of course, because they are all highly influential figures of their time. And they all approach the problem of the psyche from very different angles: evolutionary biology, physiology, criminalistics, psychoanalysis, and most importantly, because they all make an appearance in Wieser's works at very important moments. So to my regard, they offer a very fascinating and comprehensive insight into the diversity of angles where they tried to solve this problem of psyche and society, but also offers an insight into the wide range of references of Wieser's intellectual scope. So due to time constraints, I will only focus on Ernst Mach here, and I will argue that both Ernst Mach and Friedrich Wieser seek to redefine the constitution of society by reshuffling the rational, autonomous self of revolutionary Europe into a psychological concept of man. Before I come to key points that I would like to, key findings that I would like to share with you today, I often get asked about the publication dates of the primary literature that I'm quoting or that I'm using in my study. So I would like to provide you with this list. And I've marked here 2 publications which I've studied, which fall into the time frame that Friedrich Wieser and Ernst Mach shared actually at the Charles University in Prague. It's about 10 years that they coexisted in Prague, which I found very interesting. And the italics here indicate the works which are connected. Wieser is quoting Machs Leitgedanken in his work Das Wesen und der Hauptinhalt der theoretischen Nationalökonomie. So for those of you who are interested in the primary sources, this is the list. But let's move on. Those are the key findings my comparative analysis of those works of Wieser and Mach produced. First of all, Wieser and Mach redefine the concept of man and the sciences of man, respectively, shifting from a substantialist, one might argue essentialist, categories to relational categories. And this redefinition follows what I coined the principle of interdependent association. So this is the red thread running through this process of redefining and reconceptualizing the concept of man. And they found this redefinition on a psychology of perception, on an epistemology, which is the foundation for the anthropology, so their new concept of man, but also the methodology and concept of science that studies this man. And fourth, by underlining the dependency of man on A, social and physical context, and B, on mostly unconscious representations, the concept of the rational autonomous subject or self is dissolved. And of course, this renders 3 core concepts of the 19th century problematic: liberty, individuality, and order. So I'm going to take you very quickly and very briefly through some key aspects of their psychology of perception, anthropology, and methodology. So sometimes a model or a picture is a little easier to understand. So let me try to illustrate and explain the psychology of perception that they both pursue or put at the foundation with a little model. We see here a model of what is intended to symbolize the physical and social environment. And here, with this very permeable boundary, the individual body, they both are very strongly behind that there is a bodily or physical aspect to the psyche, and in the center here in blue, the psyche with its unconscious and its conscious. Both Wieser and Mach place an associationist model of the psyche as the foundation of their argument. And as we can see here, it's a very integrated concept of world and self. The self is infused by the world, by the social and physical concept, and the psyche is, as I said, embodied and also has physical dimensions. Man, the individual, experiences sensations which become modified by representations, which are nothing else than memories of past sensations, and thereby determine how a human being judges, perceives, and acts. This is actually an evolving circular process. So there's a missing circular error here. And from the first breath a human takes, it learns to associate certain judgments, values, emotions to certain sensations, and thereby grows and expands this network of associated representation. So those representations become more in quantity, but now they also increase their complexity of their respective associations. So we would today maybe call this the process of socialization. This is how they put it. And what is important to note here, the impact of those representations or associations, how we could call them, is unconscious. And it's mostly out of control of the individual. Mach elaborates a lot on the psychophysical backbone to this. And Wieser, he concentrates more on the social and political aspect of this. I think I cannot go into further detail here, but I just wanted, since Wieser is the subject of my thesis, or one of the subject of my thesis, I just wanted to mention that he also has this social layer to it, so that he dubs the network of associated representations the other. He places society and the other in the psyche, to literally speaking, says that this impact that I indicated earlier is actually nothing else than the voice, quote unquote, the voice of social law within. And he adds this aspect of power, of inner power, which is nothing else than the respective alignment and voluntary alignment of this network of representations between individuals. This is in the first paper. I won't discuss it, but I wanted also not only to show the commonalities between Mach and Wieser, but also how they differ and complement each other. So what consequences does that have for their anthropology, for their concept of self? First, a deconstructive one, which is illustrated by the references to the 18th century physicist and philosopher Georg Christoph Lichtenberg. And I just want you to focus on those blue words here. Mach, to say cogito, is already too much as soon as we translate it thinks, or cogito, with I think. And secondly, when Wieser refers to Lichtenberg and this notion of it thinks, the consciousness works unconsciously and cannot give itself an account of why the facts appear and disappear in it. So what we see here is the dissolution of the sense of ego or I or individuality, but also this sense of self-awareness, self-consciousness, and based on that, an autonomously acting individual. And this also relativates the classical cognitive authorities such as free will, soul, and consciousness. And here, those challenges that I mentioned earlier to individuality, liberty, and order arise. But they don't only deconstruct, they also construct. And I call this new concept of man that they both implicate or indicate Homo Associates associans. So a human being that is already and ever and always connected to the world, to others, but is also in the process of ever constantly associating itself. And this meaning can be, the meaning of the concept can be summarized by those two motti. First, in the sense of Lichtenberg, it associates, therefore it is. This speaks to the integration of man in the evolutionary biology of Mach. And it means that a human being is association both as a state and a process. Association here means the network of associated representations, so the psychophysical memory of this individual, but it also stands for social relations. This individual, this particular body is born into certain cultural, family, national, class, or economic context. And both Wieser and Mach actually use the word association for this social relationship too. And the other aspect indicated by the associans is that this entity is constantly reassociating itself, developing an evolving network of associations by a mostly unconscious process of analogy, introspection, and imitation. But, and this is already somehow the first resolve of the challenge to individuality, they don't neglect or lose that at all. You can also modify this motto into I associate, therefore I am, because both agree that individuality arises from the historical uniqueness of a particular human's body, its genes, but it's also its particular historical context and the experiences this individual lives through. Lastly, what I want to specify is that both Wieser and Mach interpret the quality of this relation, of this association, as interdependent. So these relations are not unilateral, but reciprocal. Individuals, organisms, they depend on each other, they give and take. And this is, for example, how Wieser also tries to solve the problem or the challenge to the concept of order. In the mutual alignment of the individual's psyche, there's a check and balance. So everybody has to adapt to the other somehow, and everybody has to make sacrifices in that process. And so for Wieser, this interdependency is the social band, the social what holds individuals together. And actually freedom also lies in the interdependent relations. And so liberty is not freedom from other individuals or society, but freedom in and through society and these relations. So in Wieser's and Mach anthropology, we see this paradigm shift from independency and autonomy to interdependency, and also this notion of a private core, a distinct and substantialistic understood individual that has to be associated a posteriori to an a priori associated individual, which can be more or better depicted as an associated permeable membrane. Last but not least, what does that mean for science?
Yeah, Theresa.
I'm out?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Okay. No, it's quite easy because it's just the application of the psychology of perception. Yeah, so it's nothing else than what they say is the foundation, or what everybody or every organism, but every human needs to think, or how every human thinks and perceives and judges, but it's just an advanced state of the evolution of man. And it's nothing else than the conscious and refined version of the everyday thinking of common man. And the scientist is, and this is, I think, most important, and remains Homo Associates associans. He cannot detach himself from this. He cannot move to a detached, objective position, but he is always, or he cannot not think like I've depicted earlier. And I think I'm going to leave this to the discussion. I was planning with 20 minutes. I didn't know we only have 15. So I don't want to further use up your attention, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Theresa. Oh, sorry, but I mean,
it's a sprint. I know it's a tour de force. I'm sorry.
In 90 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, it's tough.
Thank you for the presentation. And now to the floor, questions, remarks, comments. Mario? No, Stefan. Do click on the hand up. Yeah. Okay, Mario, please. You have to switch the mic on, Mario. Mario, you are muted.
I imagined that what Mises' reaction would have been to all of this. So this is quite something. I was reminded in some ways of how Hayek, maybe it was in the Counter-Revolution of Science, said that insofar as society is greater society is greater than the individual only insofar as it is free. And to what extent does all of this social associationism, et cetera, have any relevance to the role of government? Or is it, a separate issue? Because I could see Hayek, to a certain extent, agreeing with this, as long as it wasn't, government wasn't involved in enforcing associations and that kind of thing.
Should I answer each one separately or one? What do you think? You're muted as well. I think I can answer it.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mario, for, yeah. Huh?
Since we are a bit late, I'm collecting all the questions and I will answer.
All right.
Okay. Stefan.
So thank you so much. This was extremely interesting, and I never realized that there was this overlap with Mach in Prague. So, and because Wieser is so bad at quoting people, I think you really uncovered something very important. My question is, you have this very rich analysis. If we try to map it to the two central categories of utility and power, which are somehow the beginning and the end of Wieser's work, how does it fit? So would you say it connects the two? Would you say it, in a certain sense, perhaps makes the one more important? Because that is what I believe the extreme value of your paper, that you provide a psychological grounding for both of those key concepts. Thank you.
Dieter?
Yeah, Theresa, thank you so much for your paper. And I liked very much this Homo Associates or Homo Associates. That was also quite new to me. I mean, when listening, especially the last part of your talk, I thought you could also draw from this message where you brought in society and the social impact. You could also link very easy to some other heroes in early sociology, let's say to Emil Durkheim or so, because that was just his attempt to bring in society, or maybe with the behavioral things later with George Herbert Mead, which is a different pair of shoes, but more or less it fits very well with your message in the paper. Then I have just a very brief notion or question. In one of your first slides, I think it was slide number 3 or 4, where you compared Mach and different publications of Mach and Wieser, and you said who is quoting which ones. You listed a publication, Das Wesen und der Hauptinhalt der theoretischen Nationalökonomie. However, this is just the title of Joseph Schumpeter's book of 1908. And so is it a mistake, or is there also a publication of Wieser under the same title in 1911, which I do not know?
Theresa, please.
I can answer the last one first because it's really quickly. You're quite right. That's in a review or a replique of Wieser to Schumpeter's work. But he uses this review as he uses so many other opportunities to lay out his own thoughts. And it's actually, he really appreciates Schumpeter's work, but he also criticizes it very fundamentally. So I might have been not very precise in quoting, but this is how this work is in my head, but it's also the title of the review. So it's just a review. And the connection to Emil Durkheim is actually quite interesting because it goes over Gustave Le Bon. And because in Wieser's work, which is most central to my thesis, Mach Psychologie in 1923, he not only works himself off Gustave Le Bon, but also Sigel and Tard, Gabriel Tard. And all those are, of course, preliminaries to the French sociology, of which Emil Durkheim is a very famous representative, and they are his antecedents. So these are very interesting points. So thank you, Stefan, for pointing this out. This is just, of course, a puzzle in the Wieser scholarship, how to unite the early and the late Wieser, and I actually think that the concept of psyche and his psychology of power is, or what I depicted here, the psychology of perception, is the underpinning red thread running through all and connecting the concept of utility, or most importantly, or more fundamentally, the concept of value to the concept of power. And I find it really interesting, and I was surprised that you can find this psychology of perception enshrined in the first works in his dissertation, but also in his habilitation, in his like in the first chapters and sentences where he lays out his theory of language. Wieser has a distinct theory of language, of philosophy of language, and there we find enshrined this psychology of perception. So this, I have to leave it for that, but we should discuss that in further detail. He also conceptualizes already in those works value as an emotion, as a psychological force. So there we already have those ideas, which he elaborates later. To your question, Mario, of course, Hayek popped up several times, especially with regard to Ernst Mach, because his first works are on Mach, or his first publication is on Mach, and then he publishes that on in Sensory Order. And the question of government is really interesting, because I will answer that with regards to Wieser. I'm not sure about the role of the government with regard to society right now, but where he is more, what he's more concerned with, and I think that also relates to Hayek, is the role of leadership, because he envisions social associations as the self-regulating, like a magnetic molecular system, and where individuals, in checks and balance keep themselves in check. And you have this reciprocal process of association and self-control and self-governance. But when you have the circular process, you kind of question yourself, where does innovation come from? Where does progress come from? Where does the direction of the self-regulating system come from? And this is where leaders come into place in the concept of Wieser. And I think that comes as close as it gets to your question, and I don't think that Hayek would disagree with Wieser here, but that will be my third my third paper. So drawing the lines from Wieser to Hayek, and I hope you will listen to me then too. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to overextended your time.
Thank you everybody, and for this. And Per, the floor is yours. With a presentation on how does entrepreneurship and credit relate, the different views of Böhm-Bawerk students, Schumpeter and von Mises. So Per, 15 minutes for you.
Great, thank you. I hope you can see my slides now.
Yes, yes.
All right, excellent. There we go. Okay, so apologies for the very long title. It sort of summarizes the whole research question that I have, and this is very much a work in progress. So I'm still trying to flesh out the details and figure out exactly what is the question that I'm answering. It's not perfectly clear to me, and I don't exactly know where to go with this either, but I know there's something very interesting here. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to just assume that you know who Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk was, and that he was second generation Austrian economist and so forth. So I'm going to skip directly to his students. First, Joseph Schumpeter, who graduated in 1906, and he made notable contributions from my perspective. Then in entrepreneurship is super important, especially the Theory of Economic Development in 1911, the first edition. What he said about entrepreneurship is that, well, he conceived of the entrepreneur as sort of a heroic character, a revolutionary who just changes things up, who disrupts the market economy. And he starts with a sort of an equilibrium view, though I think it's relying on the English translation rather than the original German. His his explanation of what an equilibrium is not the general equilibrium view of Arrow de Breu that we typically think of using those terms today, but rather more of a sort of Say's law kind of aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. But for his view of the entrepreneur, we are sort of in a circular flow, in a balanced market situation where you can't really introduce anything new because all the resources are tied up in their valued productions. The entrepreneur then steps in and introduces something new, disrupts the whole thing by showing that, hey, look at this, there's something novel and more valuable that we can do with this. And by introducing these new combinations of factors, this entrepreneur raises their productivity, and therefore the total output, which means basically the rest of the economy freaks out, and they see this opportunity and they have to follow. So everybody rushes to this new level of productivity, and a new equilibrium is established at this higher level. So everything is due to the entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur sort of comes in as an external character and almost an exogenous force in this market system, and shakes it up and disrupts it, and thereby the economy takes a step or even a leap forward. And that's sort of the gist of economic development to Schumpeter. Now, when I said that it's not really a general equilibrium, but it's rather a Say's law kind of circular flow, the way I read Schumpeter is that he is really talking about how, according to the old law of markets, the people's purchasing power is based off of their contribution to the market economy. So in order to buy demand from others' supply, you have to first supply something. So your demand is constituted by your supply. And in this sense, you can't really escape the fact that aggregate demand equals aggregate supply in the Say's law in kind of sense. And this is how I interpret Schumpeter's discussion in that chapter in the Theory of Economic Development, that because of these resources are tied up, all of them are used, and people are buying and selling, but they're buying and selling limited. Their buying is limited by their selling throughout the production process and so forth. You can't really create something new. You can't really experiment with anything, because that's a loss to begin with, because you already have all factors tied up in production that is of value. So in order to take those resources and do something else and attempt something else, you have to really believe that this is of higher value, and the uncertainty itself might actually be prohibitive, simply because well, you're losing a lot by not using the resources in the already established equilibrium production processes. So for Schumpeter, then, the entrepreneur, to disrupt this economy, must be provided new purchasing power in order to acquire these resources. So in order for me to start a new business and to disrupt the economy, I have to be provided with the purchasing power that I have not earned, but so that I can then outbid whoever owns or wants to use the resources available in the economy. So the entrepreneur then steps in with these new monies, buys the resources, and attempts thereby to disrupt the economy, trying something new. But the entrepreneur cannot enter the circular flow without creating of this new credit. So this very briefly, Schumpeter on entrepreneurship and credit. Now, his fellow student, Ludwig von Mises, graduated also in 1906, and also wrote on entrepreneurship and credit, but focused more on credit than on entrepreneurship, whereas Schumpeter focused more on entrepreneurship than on credit. But they both see these issues as strongly related, and both empirically and theoretically, that they have to do with each other, but in very different ways. And that's what I find really interesting here. So entrepreneurship to Mises is sort of also a heroic character. In general, he defines it as simply the aspect of uncertainty in any action. But this is a very general definition. It includes any action you might take has an entrepreneurial aspect to it. But in the marketplace, in the market process, the driving force is not simply uncertainty bearing in general, but it's rather the promoter, which is a subcategory of entrepreneurship function. That is a super important, or really the driving force behind all these greater adjustments or great changes in the economy. Similar to Schumpeter, this promoter Mises did not really pursue, because he found it that while it is a concept that economics cannot do without, because we can't explain the expansion of the economy and economic growth without understanding the promoter. He said, well, I can't define it praxeologically, Mises said, so I'm not going to go there because it's just going to be pretty arbitrary anyway. Or it might be an empirical definition, and that still wouldn't fit with Mises' view of theory. So I have published research, though, showing that you can actually define the promoter praxeologically using a different imaginary construction, as Mises called them, a model. So we can actually go there, but that's a much more contemporary issue. So for Mises then on credit, he had a very different view, or very similar view, depending on your perspective, as Schumpeter. So Mises considered credit to be basically an evil, if you will, simply because adding new or expanding credit simply introduces purchasing power that is not reflected in the price structure of the economy. And therefore, your new purchasing power creates an imbalance or creates a disruption in sort of the productive structure of the economy. So you can buy or acquire more resources, and therefore there's less resources left for others, which then means that there's malinvestment overall in the economy. This could be big or small, of course. If someone provides me with $1 new, it's not going to have a huge effect on the economy. But if, say, I'm a president and I create $2 trillion that I invest in infrastructure, that's going to have a big effect, because a lot of resources are going to be shifted into infrastructure manufacturing and infrastructure repair, resources that could have been used elsewhere. So this is Mises starts the business cycle theory with credit expansion, and how this new credit creates first a boom, and that is unsustainable because it's artificial, and which then turns into a bust. So this is the Austrian theory of the business cycle, very briefly. Okay, so my observations then, reading these two students of Böhm-Bawerk's, is that they have very similar views of the entrepreneur, or that is the promoter, not the entrepreneurship function, in the economy. The entrepreneur is the disruptor, it's the innovator, it's the bringer of new things, it's the function that shakes things up, that introduces greater productivity, greater value creation, and so forth. Both Mises and Schumpeter have similar views in terms of the marketplace having a sort of a natural order or natural balance to it. They don't have the same view, however, in what this balance actually means. So Schumpeter appears to assume more of an equilibrium type of circular flow, whereas Mises assumes a market process that is always progressing or retrogressing. He said that there's no in between, so it has to do either expand or contract. And he would assume that, I think that the market process left to its own devices would progress and expand rather than the other way. And then in terms of credit, they both saw credit as something that facilitates and really boosts entrepreneurship. But then where they differ is that Schumpeter saw this as a necessity for entrepreneurs to create a new level of productivity and thereby, in a sense, force the market to a higher equilibrium point or higher level of productivity, that is economic development. Whereas Mises saw that, yeah, credit facilitates entrepreneurship through new purchasing power, but it's the wrong entrepreneurship. It's the entrepreneurship that creates an unsustainable bubble that is not actually motivated by consumers, but is instead, or consumer value, but is instead motivated by whoever is creating the credit and where the money happens to end up, which is not the same thing. Okay, so this is curious, not only because they agree to such large extent and disagree to this minor detail that is very important. It's also curious because they both have a similar starting point and they're both students of the same economist. So they both assume, it seems, much of what Böhm-Bawerk was working on in terms of production structure and stages of production and interest rates and things like that. But they both identify the entrepreneur as this heroic character, but they tend to, or they don't tend to, they have very different views of the impact of credit on basically the Böhm-Bawerkian system, which I find very interesting. The question for me, though, is what paper is this? Which is a strange question to ask, but is this a history of economic thought paper where I go through Schumpeter and Mises from the perspective of Böhm-Bawerk, or at least using Böhm-Bawerk as a frame, trying to figure out the ideas and where they come from and where they might lead? Is this an entrepreneurship theory paper? Because it's the entrepreneur is at the core, and both Schumpeter and Mises are cited heavily in the entrepreneurship literature. Or is this a paper that is just about Austrian economics, maybe history of economic thought in Austrian economics? Because it could be that too. Since both Mises and Schumpeter were trained as Austrian economists, and Schumpeter deviated later on, but still, this is very early. So what kind of paper is it? Is this enough? I mean, Schumpeter and Mises, they're both notable economists, but they're also notable free market economists and free market students of Böhm-Bawerk's. But Böhm-Bawerk had other students. So what about Henry Grossman, for instance, who definitely does not fit the free market label? Should I include him too? And what would that mean in that case? So those are questions I'm dealing with right now. And as you can see, what kind of paper is this? It's sort of a very big question. It could be the case that it's all three. Like this could turn into 3 papers. I don't know. But if you have any thoughts on this, I would really appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Per. Perfectly in time. And so now I open the floor for question and answers. Maybe 5 minutes because we are slightly in delay, but questions? Mario? Dieter? Mario first.
Okay, I think I need to make a distinction, and perhaps you do as well, between credit and credit expansion. We could imagine a constant amount of credit being available in the economy, and then a scenario like this. Somebody has repaid a loan. The bank now has this credit, the existing credit, now to re-lend, and 2 people come. One is a person from the old school who wants to continue making horseshoes, and another guy who says, well, we don't need horseshoes as much now. What we need is, and something related to automobiles. So the disruptor comes and the conservative guy comes, and the bank says, okay, you disruptor, you get the money. All right. So you still have entrepreneurship or promotion without an increase in the aggregate amount of credit. So I'm wondering, does that sort of satisfy Mises' concerns and permit a certain reconciliation between the views?
let us collect also Dieter's question. Then you may answer Per, and then if there are other questions, of course, we can go on a little bit. Dieter, switch on the microphone.
Yes, thank you, Per. Very interesting presentation and talk, and I'm very curious to have a look at the paper. I mean, you raised a few questions in the end. I cannot give you an answer. That is really difficult. Where the paper, in which box it does fit. You distinguish in the beginning history of economic thought or Austrian economics. In my view, Austrian economics is a sub box of history of economic thought. Anyway, it's up to you to find the right answer to that. I enjoyed very much that you also referred so widely in the beginning to the circular economy and this thing, because according to Schumpeter, the conventional assumption that each, to speak with Kantian, each undertaker is an entrepreneur is not given. I mean, Schumpeter takes the entrepreneur only as this person is connected to a growing economy and including risk taking and capital taking. So all the others are just in the circular economic are just economic men as such, as he says. Yeah. So, but my point is another one. You referred so very widely to the heroic man, the entrepreneur as a heroic man. I've some doubts. Of course, especially Schumpeter speaks about the entrepreneur as the Prince of Denmark within Shakespeare's Hamlet. So that is the central role. I would say, yes, it is a central and very important role, but it is not an heroic actor as we are usually using this term, because Schumpeter, especially in his first book, or not first book, in his Theory of Economic Development in German in 1911, so he is raising the question, why is the entrepreneur doing this stuff at all? Yeah, what motivates this person? What is the driving engine? And then he comes up with a typology of 4 or 5 points, and he is very distinct to that. He is very critical with this type of man, the entrepreneur. It is more a person he belongs on the red couch of Sigmund Freud, yeah, because he has no other aims in life. Yes, he does it in compensation of other social goals in life and so on. So, I mean, it is a very contradictory figure, and heroic is a bit so positive. It is so too charming. I think Schumpeter was much more distinct to this figure. So ambivalent. Of course, he is a creator, but he is also a bit whatever. Maybe creators have to be a bit whatever, limited with other social goals and aims. He said he just does economic action as a kind of sport, more boxing. So to overcome or to against others. Sorry for talking so long.
Please.
Yes, thank you. Good questions. So I'll start with Mario in the order you asked them. I think that's a very good point with total credit versus expanded credit. And I think Mises would say that, well, you get these effects by expanding credit, not having credit. Schumpeter, I can't recall exactly his phrasing. And I, of course, with respect to Dieter's question, I rely on the English translation, which is also not super accurate. And it's only one edition of the 3 as well. So I can't recall if he's talking specifically about expanding credit or if he's talking about the need for credit. So that's something I will need to look into for sure. But it's a good point. It makes a whole lot of difference. For Dieter's question, yeah, I meant heroic in this superhero sense, disrupting production, not necessarily wearing a cape, and not necessarily being very positive either, but having a positive effect on productivity for sure. So from standard of living perspective, I suppose the entrepreneur is a heroic character, but the entrepreneur, the man, might not be, of course.
I would definitely add Grossman to your paper. That would be very interesting.
For the history-economic thought paper, or for something else?
Well, you choose.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, we have to move on to the last paper because we are really running out of time. So, Stefan.
Yes, thank you so much. It has been a fantastic session, and I'll try to be brief so that we have some time for comments. I hope you can now see the presentation. The title slightly deviates from what we submitted, and I was happy with it until a couple of days ago, but then I found a German paper by Erich Streisler, which actually has the same title, so we need to change it yet another time. This is joint work with Erwin Dekker, who couldn't make it today because of an obligation, but again, this is joint work, as you will see, also a piece of a larger project. So we kick out with saying that Schumpeter, about whom we just heard quite a bit, writes this obituary in 1915 and says, well, Austrian economics, as seen from Menger, Böhm-Bawerk, and Wieser, actually came out of nothing, from another world, which then miraculously brought us Menger, Böhm-Bawerk, and Wieser. In that paper, Erwin and I tried to see what kind of a world was that, where those people miraculously appeared from, and how they, the Austrian economists and some of their satellites, actually mattered for that world. And the world is the world of German economics. And this is what we would like to address. So very briefly, we have a first chapter, which to begin with starts by saying that we have this book project, which starts in, roughly speaking, 1840 and ends in 1940, saying that there are lots of continuities from the older German historical school to ordoliberalism, which we would like to explore. And the paper tries to fit in Menger's principles, but also Menger as a whole into those continuities. Now, there is, as it is widely known to those who are interested in Austrian economics, a tradition of German subjectivism, to which Menger contributed. I mean, most famously, he dedicated his principles to Rorschach. But it's not just Rorschach. It's also a person who might well be forgotten for most, even historians of economics, Hufeland, who before Ricardo actually formulated a subjectivist value theory. And we have those several figures, which, I mean, many of them you can see here also in the title, who already had a very sophisticated idea about subjective value well before Menger. And Erich Streisler, on whom we draw to initiate the paper, I think rightly makes the point that in that respect, Menger was not even a reformist, right? So he tweaked and changed that framework, but certainly not a revolutionary and perhaps even not a reformer. Now, what is subjectivism? We try to frame it like that. We see subjectivism as a baby of that larger German idea of idealism, but we call it individualist idealism, meaning that we need to basically have a look at such an equation, which very simply puts the terms as if we subtract from idealism the collectivist notions which we had in idealism, we get subjectivist economics, both of that school and of Menger. The main part of the paper, and I went very briefly over the first one, is what is the relationship between the Germans and the Austrians? And that not only in terms of the Methodenstreit, but more generally speaking, starting in the 1880s when Menger and Schmoller have their positions in Vienna and Berlin. Now, the big difference which we identify is that the Germans were not just historical or applied or whatever, but really they, as we see it, the main twist which happened was what we call the applied turn. So applied economics was practiced not by the older historical school, to which Menger, I think, rightly belongs, but by that younger historical school of the people around Schmoller. And in that very same place of Eisenach, first of all, the Social Democratic Party was founded, and then a few years later, the Verein für Sozialpolitik. Why? Well, the Social Democratic Party was heavily Marxist and extremely revolutionary. And so those Germans like Schmoller and the Verein economists, who were basically a group of sort of young people at the time, at the age of 30-something, said, well, if we don't get reform, we might get the revolution, and then that's the end of both bourgeois society and capitalist economy. And so that applied turn, which they jumped on, was actually made urgent by the changes in German society, which did not happen as quickly, important in our paper, in Austria as they did in Germany. So was it a Methodenstreit or an Institutionenstreit? Well, we believe that the notion of institutions and the notion of shapeability of institutions is crucially important. And to that question, the central question is, when do we know enough so that we can shape institutions, like the reformist institutions or the Verein economists, if that is urgent? So of course, evolution gets us better and ever new knowledge, but do we perhaps know enough if we are forced by circumstances, by the context of time and space, to shape institution? And in that regard, actually, the two differed radically. Schmoller said we have to, Menger was much more reluctant about that. Just a tiny footnote. Translating those texts has been one of my hobbies, shared with some friends like Karen Horn. So you can check out Menger's Errors of Historicism, which we translated now currently. We are translating that discourse between Schmoller and Menger, which has been largely untranslated so far. So the Austrians, unlike the Germans, waited with the applied term. And the applied term happened in the late 1880s and early 1890s. Why? Well, first of all, the empire was in decline, so theoretical economics was important, of course, but applied economics became even more important. Also because social democracy came to Austria later than in Germany, and also less revolutionary than in Germany, more reformist. So Menger has this piece on Smith in 1890, where he says, well, social policy is something which was always on the mind of economists. But the notion of Schmoller and his Verein economists is that, yes, of course, people knew all the way that we need to pacify society and help the poor. The question is, how do we do that in our new context of that late 19th century with the gigantic transformations of economy and society, including, by the way, the democratization of society, which made social democracy such an extremely powerful force. Interestingly, we have not just Filipovic, who was always an in-between between the applied Germans and theoretical Austrians. We also have Böhm-Bawerk. And Böhm-Bawerk, in a programmatic piece when the Austrians founded their journal in 1892, has this interesting take, basically saying that the Methodenstreit was, in a certain sense, nonsensical. And pronouncements like this one we have both from Menger and from Schmoller from later years. So he has this very neat and nice division of labor between what practitioner, a statistician, historian, and abstract theories have to do. Which doesn't mean that we don't need theory. The Austrians, of course, stick to the notion that for social policy we need theory, but we cannot remain limited to abstract theory. We have to draw the applications from that abstract theory. And there is no unified we, but there is a division of labor of those different roles. In 1894, the Verein had a meeting in Vienna, which was quite interesting institutionally, because you can actually see many Austrians moving to the Verein, joining the Verein, and also if you study the proceedings of that meeting, you can see that Schmoller being the president of the Verein, Inama Sterne being the president of the Austrian Society, and Filipovic actually chaired the session. So it is certainly a moment when the Austrians, the masses of Austrian economists, including Böhm-Bawerk and Wieser, join that applied economics. That doesn't mean that they detach themselves from theoretical economics, but it does mean that the applied turn became difficult to overlook. Menger didn't. That's what we claim. Of course, he engaged in currency reform, but otherwise he remained, well, in a certain sense, older German historical school. This is a picture which Erwin found just recently from 1915. And he doesn't look happy. And as we know, in the end of his life, meaning the last 20 years, he hardly published anything. So was it the alienation from the younger Austrians which made him sad, in addition to many other things which happened? It could well be. in the very last days before the conference, we found a piece which might be quite interesting because actually Hayek in the Menger bibliography has misspelled the month. So actually it's put as 23rd of September, but it's actually October. So this is a piece from Neue Freie Presse, Menger's favorite newspaper, right after the second meeting of the Verein in 1909 in Vienna. And here you can actually see a happy Menger. He's happy that even though never before the Verein studied theoretical issues, he sees the youngsters, meaning Weber and Sombart, who actually want to get back to theory by the way of methodology. So he sees methodology and the serious engagement with value judgments and related questions by the youngsters as a sign of hope that theory will get its central place. So to finish the presentation, Menger didn't come from vacuum. He came from German economics. Then German economics transformed. Many of his students did as well. He remained alienated, but not quite detached. And again, in the end, we can see that it's always from the Methodenstreit to 1909 to the Werturteilstreit. It is really about the division of labor between theory and empirics, between induction and deduction. It never was the either or, which we got into the heated months of the Methodenstreit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Excellent. And you spared more than 5 minutes for discussion. Yes, great. And so the floor is open. Mari.
You make a number of points, and I've also, since I've read the paper, I'm still confused about what the overall theme is. You seem to be okay, on the one hand, you're saying, okay, subjectivism in economics, it has predecessors. So Menger is not particularly innovative or original there. Then you say, oh, and the Methodenstreit really was a misunderstanding. It really wasn't about a difference in methods. So it was more about the division of labor and all of that. And so that wasn't very important. I could easily come away from this thinking that what you're saying is Menger was not very important. Persuade me otherwise.
Stefan.
Should I reply immediately? Yeah.
No, yes, immediately.
No?
Immediately. Yes, now.
So the story is not that Menger was not innovative. That is just the first part, and I mean, this point has been made more convincingly than we can. The point is that Menger is not only not innovative in the beginning, but actually stagnant all over his life. And compared to the Germans, he's much less receptive to the necessities of the age, which we call the applied turn. Which doesn't mean that he's obstinate or that he, how should I say, he is unwilling to recognize it. But unlike even his fellow Austrians, he remains anti-applied. That is what we would like to say, as many of the old Germans we've been talking to. But I agree with you that we have to connect the two parts even better. I agree about that.
Theresa?
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for your presentation. I wanted to ask you whether you could elaborate a little more on the German subjectivism. You showed Hufeland, Rau, and Roscher, of course. So maybe you could elaborate a little more on them. So why do you think their thinking, and especially their economic thinking in the case of Roscher, is a case of German subjectivism? And maybe you could also touch upon the question where Max Weber comes into place in this context, because of course he is also important. You've written on him, and in the whole genesis of the Verein für Sozialpolitik, he's very important. So those two.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes, so I'll try to be very brief. So on the subjectivism point, I think it is fascinating that we have both subjectivism and marginalism expressed very neatly and very explicitly in all of the people you saw on that slide. I mean, the pictures, but also the lines. So what I find personally fascinating about this is that if we understand subjectivism as a baby of idealism, you can actually say that we have German subjectivist economics, and then we have classical political economy, which you can call materialist economics. So materialism basically leads you to objective value theory, whereas idealism leads you to subjective value theory. And I think this is a bold claim, but a claim which we will try to substantiate. So the early Marx would be the German subjectivist, but then he moves to London and becomes a British materialist, also in terms of basically the pieces of his work. So that is why I believe that it is important to place Menger there, not to show that he is non-original, but really to understand that subjectivism was something which not just distinguished, but actually made continental economics, perhaps similar also in Italy and France, so distinct from Brits, right? So the opposition to classical political economy can also be understood, as I see it, not just because they were Brits and because the economic order was better differentiated in England than it was on the continent, but also because that materialist objective value theory was seen as something very alien. And perhaps that is why also Marx actually never made it as a big theorist until the very late 19th century into Germany. That's another bold hypothesis. Now, Weber is certainly a bit of a different and difficult story, but that is why I'm so happy we found this misplaced piece of Menger in the newspaper, which was the final slide, right? So Menger has, so Weber has strong sympathies for Menger. He says that Menger didn't have the tools to resolve the Methodenstreit. So Mario mentioned in his presentation the ideal type. That is a concept which popped up in 1900, right? So it was not discovered yet. So I do believe, and we have a special issue on Weber, which I can send to any of you in tomorrow's Yahoo that came out recently. I do believe that Weber understood the urgency and the necessity for applied economics, but tried hard to reconcile it with the necessity also for theoretical economics. So in a certain sense, he is the guy who elegantly bridges the obstinate Menger and the obstinate Schmoller, if we want to call them like that. So in that regard, your point is very valuable. And the 1909 meeting is valuable in that regard because it, of course, everything which happens afterwards in the Werturteilskreis is an attempt to somehow make sense and make something productive out of the Methodenstreit.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, everybody. And before we leave the session, I invite you to look at the chat, because Stefan, a few minutes ago, put in the chat a link to Wieser review of Schumpeter, Wesen an Hauptnalt. So I think you can download it from Dropbox.
Yes.
At least those of you who can read German. and if we close the session, the chat is going to disappear. So I'll leave you.
It's available in English.
To click on it, to click on the link and download it.
It's available. The review of Schumpeter is available in English.
Ah, okay. Okay.
In the collection by Israel Kirzner on the classics of Austrian economics.
Thank you. Thank you, Mario. And thanks, everybody. It was a great session, and it was a pleasure also to meet some of you who haven't met before. And thanks again to everybody. And I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
For sharing.
Nicola.
Yeah, it was a difficult job which you had. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
See
you.
you all. Bye-bye.